In the year 1922, in a moment of great optimism and ambition, representatives of the 7 states that share the Colorado River gathered to divide up its waters, to settle once and for all how the great river of the desert Southwest would be apportioned among the states that depended upon it. The agreement they reached, the Colorado River Compact, was a landmark achievement, a foundational document that would govern the river for the next century and shape the development of the entire American West. It divided the river between an upper basin and a lower basin, allocating to each a share of the water, establishing the framework within which the states would build their cities and their farms and their civilization in the desert. It was, in its way, a triumph of cooperation and foresight, an attempt to bring order and certainty to the sharing of a precious and contested resource. But there was a flaw at the very heart of the compact, a flaw so fundamental that it would take a century to fully reveal itself, and it is this: the compact divided up more water than the river actually contained. It promised, in effect, water that never existed. And now, 100 years later, the bill for that promise has finally come due. This is the story of the great and fateful miscalculation at the founding of the modern West, of the water that was promised but never truly existed, and of the reckoning that has now arrived as the consequences of that century-old error finally assert themselves. To understand how such a monumental error could have been made, you have to understand the circumstances under which the compact was negotiated and the state of knowledge at the time. In the early part of the 20th century, when the states came together to divide the river, the science of measuring river flows was young, and the record of the Colorado River's flow was short. Spanning only a couple of decades, the negotiators had to base their division of the water on the measurements available to them, on the record of the river's flow as it had been observed in the preceding years. And here lay the trap, for the years on which they based their estimates happened to have been unusually wet years, a period when the river ran higher than its long-term average, when more water flowed down the Colorado than would prove to be typical over the longer span of time. The negotiators, looking at this record, concluded that the river carried a certain amount of water, a generous amount, and they divided that amount among the states, allocating to the upper basin and the lower basin their shares based on this optimistic figure. The problem, which would only become clear over the following decades, was that the river did not actually carry as much water as the negotiators had believed. The wet years on which they had based their estimates were not representative of the river's true long-term flow, which was significantly lower. As the record of the river's flow lengthened over the years that followed, as more decades of measurement accumulated, it became increasingly clear that the average flow of the Colorado River was substantially less than the amount that had been divided up in the compact. The negotiators had allocated the water as though the river carried its wet year abundance every year, but in truth, the river carried, on average, considerably less, so that the sum of the shares they had allocated exceeded the water that the river actually provided. The compact had divided up a river that existed only in the unusually wet years of the early 20th century, not the river that actually flowed over the long run, and the difference between the two was the water that never existed. The phantom allocation that would come to haunt the entire system. This overallocation, this gap between the water that was promised and the water that actually flowed, is the fundamental flaw at the heart of the Colorado River system, the original error from which so much of the current crisis flows. When you allocate more water than a river provides, you create a system in which the demands on the water exceed the supply. A structural imbalance built into the very foundation of the arrangement. The states, holding their allocations, developed their cities and their farms on the assumption that the water would be there, building an entire civilization on the promise of the compact, on the shares of water that the agreement had granted them. But the water to fulfill all of those shares did not exist, not in the average years, and so the system was destined, from the beginning, to face a reckoning, a moment when the demands based on the promised allocations would collide with the reality of the river's true and lesser flow. For a long time, however, this fundamental flaw was hidden, masked by circumstances that allowed the system to function despite the overallocation, and understanding why it stayed hidden for so long is key to understanding the crisis. In the early decades after the compact, the states did not immediately use their full allocations, for their populations were smaller and their development was still growing, so that the total amount of water actually withdrawn from the river was less than the amount allocated. The upper basin in particular was slow to develop and did not use its full share for many years, which meant that even though the water had been overpromised on paper, the actual withdrawals did not yet exceed the supply. And crucially, the great reservoirs that were built to store the river's water, the enormous reservoirs behind the great dams, provided an enormous buffer, storing the water in the wet years and releasing it in the dry ones, smoothing out the variations in the river's flow and allowing the system to deliver the promised water even when the river ran low. As long as the reservoirs held their vast reserves, the overallocation remained hidden, the system drawing on the stored water to cover the gap between the promises and the reality. But the buffer that hid the flaw could not last forever, and this is where the bill finally came due. Over the decades, as the populations of the region grew and the development expanded, the demands on the river increased, the states drawing ever closer to using their full allocations, the total withdrawals climbing toward the limit of what the river and the reservoirs could provide. And then came the drought, a long and severe dry spell that gripped the basin for more than 2 decades, reducing the flow of the river below even its normal average, deepening the gap between the demands and the supply. Year after year, the states withdrew more water than the river provided, and to cover the difference, they drew down the reservoirs, spending the vast reserves that had been accumulated over the decades. The reservoirs, which had hidden the overallocation for so long, were steadily emptied, drawn down to cover the persistent gap between the promises of the compact and the reality of the river, until they fell to alarming lows, their once vast reserves depleted. And as the reservoirs emptied, the flaw that had been hidden for a century was finally revealed, the overallocation laid bare, the water that never existed exposed as the phantom it had always been. This is the reckoning that has arrived, the bill that has finally come due, a century after the compact promised water that never existed. The buffer of the reservoirs, which had allowed the system to function despite the overallocation, has been drawn down toward exhaustion, and the states can no longer draw on the stored water to cover the gap between their promised allocations and the river's true flow. The fundamental imbalance, hidden for so long, has asserted itself, and the region now faces the consequence of the original error, the need to reduce its use of the water to bring it into line with what the river actually provides. This is an enormously painful and difficult reckoning, for it means that the states must give up some of the water they were promised, must use less than their allocations, must confront the fact that the compact granted them shares of a river that does not carry enough water to fulfill them all. The bill for the century-old miscalculation has come due, and it is being paid in the form of cuts and shortages, and the difficult negotiations over who must give up how much of the water that was promised but never truly existed. The magnitude of the reckoning is difficult to overstate, for it strikes at the foundation of the entire arrangement that has governed the river and shaped the West for a century. The compact and the allocations built upon it are the legal and structural basis of the region's water, the framework within which the states have developed and grown. And the recognition that the compact promised the water calls that entire framework into question. To bring the use of the river into line with its true flow requires reducing the allocations, or at least the actual use of the water, which means renegotiating or working around the century-old agreement, confronting the entitlements that the compact established, and distributing the pain of the reduction among the states in some way that they can accept. This is an extraordinarily contentious and difficult process, for each state holds its allocation as a legal right, and none wishes to give up more than it must, and the negotiations over how to share the burden of the reckoning have been long and fraught. The bill that has come due is not a simple debt to be paid, but a fundamental restructuring of the arrangement that has governed the river, a painful adjustment to the reality that the water promised a century ago never truly existed. The situation has been made worse by the warming of the climate, which has deepened the gap between the promises of the compact and the reality of the river, adding a further dimension to the reckoning. As temperatures rise across the basin, the flow of the Colorado River has declined even below its historical average, the warming reducing the runoff and increasing the losses to evaporation, so that the river carries even less water than it did when the overallocation first became apparent. This means that the gap between the promised allocations and the actual flow has grown wider. the water that never existed becoming even more phantom, the reckoning even more severe. The warming climate suggests, moreover, that the reduced flow is not a temporary condition that will pass when the drought ends, but a lasting shift toward a drier river, which means that the overallocation is not merely a matter of a bad dry spell, but a permanent feature of the new reality. The bill that has come due is not just the bill for a century-old miscalculation, but a bill that grows larger as the climate warms and the river shrinks further, deepening the reckoning that the region must face. It is worth understanding how the compact divided the water, because the structure of that division shapes the way the reckoning falls today. Rather than dividing the river among the 7 states individually, the negotiators divided it into 2 great groups, an upper basin and a lower basin, allocating to each of these a share of the water and leaving the states within each group to divide their portion among themselves. The upper basin, where the water originates in the mountains, and the lower basin, where much of the water is used in the deserts, were each granted a portion, and the upper basin was obligated to deliver a certain amount of water downstream to the lower basin, an obligation that persists even as the river shrinks. This structure, dividing the river between the 2 basins, was an attempt to balance the interests of the states where the water came from and the states where it was used, but it also built in tensions that endure to this day. For the upper basin and the lower basin have different interests and different exposures to the shortage, and the obligation of the upper to deliver water to the lower becomes a heavier burden as the river declines. The reckoning over the water that never existed plays out, in large part, along the fault line between these 2 basins, each seeking to protect its own share as the reality of the shortage sets in. Later, the arrangement was extended to include Mexico. For the Colorado River flows across the border, and a treaty guaranteed a share of the water to Mexico as well, adding another claim on a river that was already overpromised. So the total of all the claims on the river, the upper basin's share and the lower basin's share and the water owed to Mexico, added up to a sum that exceeded the river's true flow, deepening the overallocation that the original compact had established. Each of these allocations was set down as a legal entitlement, a right to a specific amount of water, and these entitlements together promised more water than the river carried, so that the fulfillment of all of them in full became impossible. This is the legal architecture of the crisis, the body of agreements that promised the phantom water, and it is this architecture that must now be confronted and, in some way, adjusted if the use of the river is to be brought into line with its true flow. The reckoning is not just a matter of using less water, but of confronting the legal promises that granted more water than existed, a far more difficult and contentious undertaking. There is a profound lesson in the story of the 1922 Compact and the water that never existed, a lesson about the danger of building on optimistic assumptions and the way that errors of foundation can echo down through the generations. The negotiators of the Compact were not foolish or malicious. They did the best they could with the knowledge available to them, basing their division on the measurements they had. But they built their great agreement on a flawed foundation, on an estimate of the river's flow that was too generous, and that flaw, invisible at first, propagated through the decades, shaping the development of the entire region on the basis of a promise that could not be kept. The lesson is that the assumptions on which we build our great systems matter enormously, that an error in the foundation can take a century to reveal itself, but can, when it does, threaten the whole structure built upon it. The Compact promised water that never existed, and the West built itself on that promise, and now the entire region must reckon with the consequences of a foundational error made 100 years ago. A sobering reminder of how the decisions of one generation can bind and burden those that follow. So the 1922 Compact promised water that never existed, dividing up a river based on the unusually wet years of the early 20th century, allocating more water than the Colorado actually carried over the long run, building a fundamental overallocation into the very foundation of the system. For a century, this flaw was hidden, masked by the slow development of the states and by the great reservoirs that stored the water and buffered the variations in the flow. But the buffer could not last forever, and as the populations grew and the drought deepened and the reservoirs were drawn down toward exhaustion, the flaw was finally revealed, the overallocation laid bare. the bill for the century-old miscalculation finally coming due. Now the region faces the painful reckoning, the need to reduce its use of the water to bring it into line with the river's true flow, a difficult and contentious adjustment made all the harder by the warming climate that is shrinking the river further. The story of the compact is the story of the West's water crisis at its most fundamental, the story of a promise that could not be kept, of water that never existed, and of the reckoning that arrives at last when the reserves that hid the flaw are finally exhausted and the truth can no longer be denied. In the end, the tale of the 1922 Compact is a cautionary tale for the ages, a demonstration of how a well-intentioned agreement built on a flawed foundation can shape the destiny of a region and then, a century later, come back to demand its reckoning. The West was built on the promise of the Compact, on the water it allocated, and that construction was, in a sense, an act of faith, a belief that the water would be there to fulfill the promises. But the faith was misplaced, the water insufficient, the promise impossible to keep in full, and now the reckoning has arrived, the bill come due, the region forced to confront the fundamental imbalance that has been there from the beginning. Whether the West can navigate this reckoning, can bring its use of the water into balance with the river's true flow, can renegotiate the century-old arrangement and distribute the pain in a way that its states and its people can accept, is the great question that hangs over the Colorado River and the entire Southwest. The water that never existed has finally been called to account, and the West must now pay the bill for a promise made 100 years ago, in a moment of optimism. On the basis of a river that flowed more generously in those